So today we are going to take a look at Lost Connections by Johann Hari. This is a book about depression, and Johann Hari's primary thrust is that the mainstream narrative on depression, that it is merely a chemical imbalance, is wrong and largely propagated by drug companies in order to obviously sell more of their drugs. Instead, what he argues is that depression is a very natural response to certain conditions when we as humans have become divorced from certain things that are essential for our well-being, and so hence the title Lost Connections. So it is the cause of these lost connections are what causes depression, more so than some sort of chemical imbalance that requires some sort of magic pill to fix. So let's take a look at a little bit of an excerpt. It was still taken for granted that these problems are caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, and antidepressants work by corresponding that chemical imbalance. If one chemical turns out not to be the psychological killer, they must start searching for another one. But Irving began to ask an awkward question. If depression and anxiety are caused by a chemical imbalance, and antidepressants work by fixing that imbalance, then you have to account for something odd that he kept on finding. Antidepressant drugs that increase serotonin in the brain have the same modest effect in clinical trials as drugs that reduce serotonin in the brain. And they have the same effect as drugs that increase another chemical, norepinephrine, and they have the same effect as drugs that increase another chemical, dopamine. In other words, no matter what chemical you tinker with, you get the same outcome. So what he points to largely for the efficacy of these drugs, and it's in the quote in the splash off to the side there, is that a lot of it comes from the placebo effect, or the story we tell ourselves about the drug. And instead, Johann Hari says we need to look at other causes of depression, namely environmental factors, and he's very critical of this narrative of merely a chemical imbalance. Although in the book he does admit that there are some biological factors, but that they're relatively minor, and it's more in terms of biological factors leave you more predisposed to be adversely affected by negative externalities that cause depression. So his chapters are named after the causes, or several of his chapters. He thinks there are 9 causes. Cause 1 is disconnection from meaningful work. Cause 2, disconnection from other people. Cause 3, disconnection from meaningful values. He cites materialism as being one of the major problems that orients us in the wrong way to be insecure. Cause 4, childhood trauma. Cause 5, disconnection from status and respect. A lot of this has to do with social inequality. 6, disconnection from the natural world. I'm not sure I agree with this one, but there are some studies that seem to indicate that he talks about that indicate that, for example, being in a greener area will, instead of a city that doesn't have any sort of plants, has positive health benefits. Cause 7, disconnection from a hopeful or secure future. So one of the things he talks about is how a lot of people are living in a gig economy type of thing, where day to day there's not a tremendous amount of job security. Cause 8 and 9, the real role of genes and brain changes. And then he has a bunch of chapters where he talks about some potential sorts of ways that you can go about helping or reconnecting. Although the main thrust of the book is, I would say, is more talking about how environmental factors and things that are not merely chemical imbalance in the brain are causing us to be depressed. One thing I found fascinating is he cites this study where it talks about how, in terms of cortisol levels, being acutely lonely is just as traumatic as being physically attacked in terms of how much cortisol you give off. Let's see. Feeling lonely, as it turned out, caused your cortisol levels to absolutely soar, as much as some of the most disturbing things that can ever happen to you. Becoming acutely lonely, the experiment found, was as stressful as experiencing a physical attack. And so I'll top off with one more excerpt from the conclusion of the book, which is further driving home his point, which is that the narrative of merely chemical imbalance is largely being pushed by drug companies. And most of the studies that are done on the efficacy of these drugs are done by the drug companies themselves, and they don't publish a lot of their studies. So if they have a study that doesn't give the outcome that they want, they just won't publish it. And so obviously there's some problems with that. So the United Nations, in its official statement for World Health Day in 2017, explained that the dominant biomedical narrative of depression is based on biased and selective use of research outcomes that cause more harm than good, undermine the right to health, and must be abandoned. There is a growing evidence base, they state, that there are deeper causes of depression, so while there is some role for medications, we need to stop using them to address issues which are closely related to social problems. We need to move from focusing on the chemical imbalances to focusing on power imbalances. So, as far as this book goes, I've spent a long period of my own life on antidepressants, and this book I would highly recommend to anyone who has depression or struggles with it, or perhaps knows someone who struggles with it. Although, let's get into the ratings, and then I'll talk about where I think this book's useful and where it might not be as useful. For utility, I gave it a 7.5. Maybe it should have scored higher. I think that if you're not depressed, maybe this book isn't as useful. Although, in theory, you could use it to help further yourself from depression, even if you're not depressed. But another thing is a lot of it is descriptive in nature, where Johann Hari's background is he's a journalist, and so that informs his writing. And so I would say more of it is telling you what's going on and giving evidence that it is these lost connections, and less so prescriptions for you, things you can do to remedy it. And even in the remedies section where he offers, it's still got a journalistic bent where he reports on people who reconnect, and it's supposed to be some sort of guide in terms of an example, more so than prescription. So for entertainment, I gave it a 6. I do think it's not necessarily the most entertaining topic, but his writing is engaging. He's a journalist. He is a professional writer before being a professional scientist, and while I think that he seems to do a very good job vetting sources and the information seems reliable, it's not reading like some of the more science-oriented background people's books will read, where they're a little drier. His reads pretty well. For interest, I gave it a 7.5. I think that thinking about the things that make us unhappy is an interesting topic. For novelty, I gave it a 9. I think that being exposed to this narrative that is in contrast with the chemical imbalance narrative, if you have depression, is extremely important. And so that's why I scored novelty high. Although not everyone is depressed. And there's also plenty of other, I don't know how many other people are ringing this bell, but there are a lot of studies that seem to indicate that there's something else going on other than chemical imbalance. For style, I gave it a 7.5. Maybe he should have been a little bit higher. I think his writing is pretty good. I think that some of it is perhaps a little more story-oriented for my taste. I think his writing is good. I think that you can tell he's a journalist by his writing. For readability, I gave it a 7. I think he presents the ideas in a fairly readable way. Yeah. Difficulty, I gave it a 6.5. Sometimes he's talking about some science which might be difficult, but he uses a lot of metaphors and analogies and brings the information to bear in a way that is highly accessible. I also think that his model of, look, there are 9 connections that we're having difficulties with, is one that's fairly easy to wrap your head around. I think that you could create another model that's perhaps better but more complex, and so I think his is great. That brings it to an overall score of 7.29. This book is on, as far as recommendations go, I think I'm inclined to recommend this book fairly aggressively and frequently. I've recommended it in the past to people who I know have difficulties with depression. I think that, and he makes this point in his book, if you're taking medication and it's working, then keep taking it because it's working. But if it's not working, this book can help you understand why. I would strongly recommend this to anyone who has depression or is close to someone who has depression. And I think that it's also useful for understanding perhaps some inequality, social justice type issues, and understanding why people become hopeless in certain situations. And some of the stuff on like being disconnected from junk value or from important values, I think is really useful. The anti-consumerism stuff. There's also disconnection from meaningful work, and I think there's another one that's like related to social status. I forget what he called it. But I think those are also important for thinking about how you're going to navigate your life and maybe help someone not get caught up in a rat race of doing stuff that's not fulfilling for materialistic reasons. Those 3 missed connections or lost connections altogether. So I'd recommend this book pretty highly. I think it's I think it's a very good book. As far as discussion goes, is there anyone who has had depression or is depressed and takes medication, and do you feel that the medication works? If you feel that it doesn't work, maybe give this book a look. If you are no longer depressed, what do you think made you feel better? Was it medication? Was it something else? One study he references pretty early on is he talks about how on the Hamilton scale of depression, which goes from I think 0 to 50 or 1 to 50, improving your sleep by a significant margin will give you like a 6-point bump in terms of the Hamilton scale. And taking antidepressants will give you a 1.8 point bump. I think it's 1.8. It might be 1.6. And it's just a very striking contrast where things like dramatically improving your sleep or your diet and starting to work out can be really effective. But man, taking a pill is really easy. So it's easier to take a pill than it is to improve your sleep. And man, the placebo effect is still there. I think that's something that gets a little bit of a bad rap, is when people are talking about the placebo effect, they act as if it doesn't work, and it demonstrably works. Placebo effect is tremendous, so if you can get free placebo effects here and there, then that's great. But one of the points that's made in the book pretty strongly is antidepressants, the placebo effect from them isn't free because they have a bunch of side effects, and so it's something that should be looked at, as well as a variety of social issues. Anyways, if you like this video, feel free to give it a like. If you want to see more book reviews, as well as other stuff I'm working on, feel free to subscribe, and have a good one.